BBC News with Hugh Edwards. It's 6 o'clock.
America says it's at war. Mr. Bush is promising vengeance. Thousands are still missing after the biggest terrorist attack in history. Horrific new images today of yesterday's plane crashes in New York. Tales of remarkable courage and great loss as events are slowly pieced together. Here, tributes at the US Embassy as many British losses are feared too. Good evening. Welcome to a special edition of the 6 o'clock news. There's still no way of knowing how many people lost their lives in yesterday's catastrophic events in the United States. Survivors are still being found in the rubble of the World Trade Center in New York, but rescue workers in Washington say they've done all they can to save people at the Pentagon. Now, this is the scene for you in New York right now. All day, rescue efforts have intensified as Americans try to come to terms with the biggest terrorist attack in history. The day has brought some harrowing stories of suffering and loss. There's no official estimate on loss of life, but no one is disputing that it's likely to be many thousands, including hundreds of firefighters and police officers. Significant numbers of Britons are thought to have perished too. Initial reports suggest that 5 Arab suspects have been identified on 2 of the hijacked planes. A short while ago, President Bush said he believed the immediate threat of further attacks had now gone away. First this evening, David Loyne on America's Day.
A blood-red sun hung over New York at dawn on the day after the disaster, the smoke as from a battlefield. If they thought they'd been asleep and dreaming, they could not have been more wrong. The nightmare did not stop with the new day. And after the fixed camera shots of yesterday have come new pictures from cameramen who were close to the attack. This was a routine drain inspection. The world was about to change.
Holy shit!
The pictures show the human scale of it for the first time. People were dying 100 stories in the air as first one airliner and then the other hit with ferocious accuracy. Guided missiles directed by unknown hands into random offices in the World Trade Center. The angle of the second plane and the size of the explosion helps to explain why the building never stood a chance. And now the cameramen were among those running for their lives.
And I just remember thinking that after a couple of seconds, this is coming at me. Yeah. And I'm not going to get out of the way. So I just turned the camera over my shoulder, pointed it up in the air, and just started running. And I've seen footage of volcano ash chasing down a village, and just knew that I was going to be in a really nasty situation. And I just dove under the biggest emergency response vehicle that I could see.
But this was no volcano, it was a man-made disaster, and the dust and smoke billowed through the amazing glass canyons of New York. And then, as night fell, they worked on and on, putting out the fires, worrying about the safety of surrounding buildings and looking for survivors, knowing that maybe 300 firefighters had been in the Twin Towers when they collapsed, among thousands of other people.
Boom, hit with all the dust, and it was black. I mean, pitch black. I don't know anybody could have survived being on the street at that time.
Personal possessions were tossed aside. What happened to the girl whose doll now lies among the debris? No one will hazard a guess as to the number of dead. Thousands died, certainly. The mayor of New York said it'll be a figure too hard to bear.
I just wanted to make sure that everything is here that could be here, and it is, so we just pray to God that we can save a few people.
In this most community-spirited of nations, people lined up to give blood.
Everything we can do to help at this time is important, so this is just a small sacrifice compared to the suffering that's going on.
And there's been potentially an early breakthrough in the criminal investigation. A hire car has been seized in Massachusetts with an Arabic language flight manual on the back seat. The FBI also found a videotape on how to fly airliners and a copy of the Quran. Even the seats where 5 Arab men are supposed to have sat down in the airport were taken away for forensic tests. The only planes in the air over America in the last 24 hours have been the Air Force, including Air Force One, the jumbo jet which carries the president, and the fighter jets escorting it. Now the president is back in Washington, rallying world opinion for action against America's enemy.
This enemy hides in shadows and has no regard for human life. This is an enemy who preys on innocent and unsuspecting people, then runs for cover. But it won't be able to run for cover forever. This is an enemy that tries to hide, but it won't be able to hide forever. This is an enemy that thinks its harbors are safe, but they won't be safe forever. This enemy attacked not just our people, but all freedom-loving people everywhere in the world.
And the first casualties of what the president said was an act of war have now been laid out, while the work goes on to treat the injured and seek any more survivors. To say that the emergency services were overstretched is an understatement, and all this in a city where normal communications were fractured. This morning, rescue workers were given new impetus when 6 firefighters were found alive in a space under the rubble.
Now, why is it that do you believe that they were able to survive such a horrendous accident?
Well, they were fortunate enough to fall into a void. When the building fell, there must have been a part of the structure that kind of surrounded them and protected them from the falling debris. So when the debris fell on the side, they were in an air pocket. And they just stayed there until help arrived, because there's a lot of voids down there. The building, the first few floors, is kind of still intact. So I'm hoping that most people undergrade, there might be a lot of voids, but unfortunately most people that were above the first few floors, very little hope as far as I know.
So let's go find him. Come on.
Brenda Schonholt set out with her daughters to look for her husband, who worked in the World Trade Center. She had heard no news of him since the attack. They were stopped at a police line.
We're asking everyone to move back.
Now, the people that were evacuated from the World Trade Center, where would they be right now?
Unfortunately, they are all over.
Officer, they're looking for their father, who was in the building.
I understand. Unfortunately, my wife is in the building, and I still haven't heard from my wife. So.
It was the story of New York, but with cell phones working again, they had a glimmer of hope. And then, unbelievably, they found him.
One little happy ending on a day with so much anguish.
In Washington, congressmen gathering to return to their offices burst into spontaneous patriotic song. But America will take more than a song before it's healed.
God bless America.
David Loyne, BBC News.
Well, now, I guess to get the latest from New York, and Jane Stanley, our correspondent, is there. Jane, what we want to know at the moment is the state of this rescue effort. What is your assessment at the moment of how things are going?
It's hard to say because the whole of downtown Manhattan, this part of the city, is completely sealed off and information is coming out very slowly. But we do understand that it's incredibly hard, slow, painstaking work. And of course, that we must never give up hope that there's just one more person alive under that rubble. People are coming to the realization that the rescues will be few and far between. We've seen fire crews working under and rescue crews working under incredibly difficult conditions. And in a city which, as you can see, Times Square behind me, is still eerie, deserted, and not really coming to terms in any way with this devastation.
Jane, I know the figures are difficult, and clearly people want to be rational and calm about things at this stage, and that's the wise thing to do. No one is, however, denying that we are talking about many thousands of losses here.
No, they're not at all. We've had those statements from President Bush and from the mayor of New York City, Rudy Giuliani, saying we're thinking in thousands. But I don't know if people have really thought that that could be, it could be tens of thousands even when you think of it. There were 50,000 people who go to work every day in those two twin towers. So that's a very frightening thought, Hugh.
It is. Jane, thank you very much indeed in New York for now. Now, let me show you some pictures we're getting from Boston. A possible development in this story. Live pictures now. Heavily armed police and FBI agents swarmed into a downtown hotel in Boston this afternoon in what appeared to be, according to reports, a possible arrest attempt in the wake of the attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon. The police cordoned off the area around Boston's Westin Copley Hotel, apparently, where an armoured vehicle and officers in riot gear arrived at the scene a short while ago. The latest from Boston. Well now, James Baker, a familiar name to all of us, is one of America's most influential voices. He was Secretary of State under George Bush Sr. He knows President George W. Bush very well. He's in our Washington studio this evening. Thank you very much for joining us, Mr. Baker. One of the things that I wanted to ask you first of all was that there are lots of concerns, of course, that Mr. Bush might be tempted to take some rather drastic action very early on. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, my thoughts are that drastic action is called for, and I would hope that they are at least considering drastic action, and I'm sure that fully 90 to 98% of the American people share that view, and I would hope that America's close allies would understand what the President said today when he said this is an assault on all freedom-loving peoples and freedom-loving countries.
The drastic action is understood, Mr. Baker. I was thinking more about the timing and the fact that lots of world leaders have been urging caution, waiting for the facts to be looked at before any action is taken. Do you share that view?
Oh, sure. I think that you don't take drastic action until you know who was responsible. But I was quite heartened, as a matter of fact, having gone through some of these same types of situations in the past, never one as bad as this, that the President said, look, we're no longer going to just look to the people who commit these terrorist acts. We're going to look to the countries and the people that harbor those terrorists and permit the creation of these events.
All fingers, nearly all fingers so far, Mr. Baker, have been pointed towards the Islamic fundamentalist Osama bin Laden. With your huge experience in this field, is that your hunch too?
Well, that would be my hunch, yes, although I must tell you I'm not privy to the classified information, and therefore that's only a hunch. But when you look at what happened to the USS Cole when in the port in Yemen, when you look at what happened to our embassies in Tanzania and Kenya, when you look at what happened in the Khobar Towers bombing, which may or may not have been Osama bin Laden related, you have to at least put him very high at the top of the list.
Mr. Baker in Washington, thank you very much for joining us this evening.
Sure.
Now, all day experts have, of course, been trying to make sense of the events that came together with horrifying accuracy yesterday. And amid the analysis, we've had some remarkable stories of human courage, and especially in glimpses of what happened on board some of those hijacked aeroplanes. John Sopel, our correspondent, is with me in the studio. John, tell us more.
Hugh, thank you. Well, the sense of utter disbelief that marked yesterday's events has given way to the searching questions about what precisely happened, but also emerging the harrowing human stories. We've now got a much clearer picture about events on the 4 aircraft used by the terrorists. You can see here Boston to the north, Washington to the south, and New York in between the two. Boston's Logan Airport was the starting point for 2 of the aircraft, American Airways Flight 11 and United Airlines 175. Both were bound for Los Angeles. Both were hijacked shortly after takeoff and were forced to head to New York. The target, downtown Manhattan and the World Trade Center. 92 people were on board the first plane to strike one of the Twin Towers. 20 minutes later, a Boeing 767 with 65 people on board hit the other. In Washington, meanwhile, American Airlines 77 takes off, also bound for LA, and is immediately commandeered. Its new destination, the side of the Pentagon building just outside the Capitol. 64 people were on board that one, including a CNN commentator, Barbara Olson. She managed to call her husband, the US Solicitor General, Theodore. She said, "The plane has been hijacked. They had knives. They rounded up the passengers and the pilots in the back of the plane. What do I tell the pilots to do?" Well, another person on that flight was Peter Gay. He'd been due to leave the day before, but had to delay his trip. Today, his father, Peter Gay Sr., spoke of the moment when he found out.
My son David, who's sitting here, came in the house and said, "I got something to tell you." And said Peter was on that plane that hit the airport, hit the tower.
And he said his son was the kind of man who'd have intervened, who'd have tried to have stopped the hijackers.
And when I hear that there were knives used and that they might have got the stewardess first, let me tell you, boy, Peter would have jumped out of that chair and went for that guy, I'm damn sure. And maybe he was knifed down also, because there was some story about someone calling on a cell phone saying that there was some stabbing going on. He was such an efficient man, such a good boy.
Peter Gay Sr. Now to the fourth plane, UA-93. It takes off from Newark, New Jersey, bound for San Francisco. It crashes just north of Shanksville, near Pittsburgh. Its probable target was the presidential retreat of Camp David. It was from this flight that possibly one of the most distressing accounts emerges. 31-year-old Mark Bingham phoned home speaking first to his aunt, Kathy Hoglan, and then his mother, Alice. Both were clearly in a highly charged emotional state when they spoke today.
He just said, I want to let you all know that I love you very, very much in case I don't see you again.
He said that?
That the plane has been taken over by hijackers. And then I said, well, we love you very much too, Mark. Let me go get your mother.
And he said, hi, Mom, this is Mark Bingham. Giving me his last name. And he said, I want to let you know that I love you. And I'm flying. I think he said I'm in the air. I'm calling you on the airphone of the airplane.
In his seat.
I presume so. He said, I want you to know I love you very much, and I'm calling you from the plane. We've been taken over. There are 3 men that say they have a bomb. And I said, well, who are they, Mark? And he repeated that he loved me, and he said, I don't think he said, I don't know who they are. He became distracted there, as if someone was speaking to him, and he said it's something to the effect of, it's true, and then the phone went dead.
The distressing human accounts. And of course, Hugh, for the investigators, one of the key questions and searches is to find the black box flight recorders.
But when you see the devastation, John, you know, what chance do they stand of finding those?
Well, they're optimistic. I mean, after Lockerbie, when the plane plunged from 33,000 feet after an explosion, they did manage to find the flight box recorders. Normally they're for 2 things. One is to find out about the technical state of the aircraft. Well, they know the answer to that because the planes were flying perfectly well. It's just where they were flying to. And that is why they're very anxious to get the other thing in the flight recorder, the voice messages between the flight deck and air traffic control and anyone else, of course, who was on the flight deck too.
Okay, John, thanks very much for that. Now, the attack has been condemned, of course, in the strongest terms by leaders worldwide. Even countries normally considered America's enemies have been expressing their disgust, and church leaders have added their voices. Pope John Paul II said it was a dark day in the history of humanity. The European Commission President Romano Prodi said the world was today standing close to America. Iran, hardly a close ally of America's, has been expressing deep sorrow and sympathy. And Libya's Colonel Gaddafi described the event as terrible. He said he was offering aid to the American people. Biggest question right now is how America might respond, how Mr. Bush might try to avenge the deaths of so many innocent people. Justin Webb has this report.
The Pentagon at dawn this morning, the heart of America's military might, deeply wounded, deeply traumatized. But the military hardware controlled from here is still in place. The ships, the planes, the soldiers, all at a high state of readiness. Their commanders on morning television talking openly of war.
American people have a clear understanding that this is a war. It's the way they see it. You can't see it any other way, whether legally that is correct or not.
You do too?
And yes, I do. And we've got to respond as if it is a war. And we've got to respond in the sense that it isn't going to be solved with a single counterattack against one individual. It's going to be a long-term conflict.
But one individual is looking very likely to be the first target for an American strike. Osama bin Laden is known to fund and train a network of anti-American terror groups from his base in Afghanistan. Military analysts believe plans to attack him could be made very soon. The first option would be a covert operation, controlled by American planes and satellites, executed by friendly local forces. Not easy to manage, say the experts, and unlikely to work. Option 2, a cruise missile strike of the kind that was tried and failed 3 years ago. There is no reason to think the outcome this time would be different. Option 3, send in American ground forces, like these in the Gulf War. It could work, but it would be political dynamite and there could be heavy casualties.
It's something that traditionally the United States has had problems with countenancing the idea of body bags coming home to the United States. That's going to have to be weighed up against the obvious desire to just do something.
There is a fourth option. America's friends in the Middle East will be pointing to the extraordinary scenes of some Muslims celebrating yesterday's horror and asking America to ask itself why this happens. What has America done to induce such loathing?
They should look at political solutions. Why the American administration is hated in the Middle East and all over the Muslim world. Definitely there is something wrong in the American foreign policies. They have to look at this and they have to listen to their friends in Europe and in the Middle East.
But subtle diplomacy, compromise, is not high on America's political agenda this evening. At the Pentagon, it was announced that no more survivors would be found here. And as the clear-up begins, the anger mounts. Justin Webb, BBC News.
Now, as we've heard, the man blamed by many for the attacks yesterday, Osama bin Laden, is being sheltered by the militant Islamic Taliban regime in Afghanistan. Our World Affairs editor, John Simpson, has just returned from Afghanistan. He's now in neighbouring Pakistan, and we can talk to him now. John, what is your assessment at the moment of the state of play with the Taliban and Osama bin Laden?
I think they're quite embarrassed. I think they're finding it really quite difficult to have him there. He's never been the same thing as the Taliban, and they've never been the same thing as Osama bin Laden. There's always been a real distinction, the host and the guest. And I think they're nervous because they must be anticipating a really big, a massive American or international strike on their country, which won't really be directed towards one man, their guest Osama bin Laden, because he'll be too difficult to get hold of. It would probably be directed at them, at the Taliban government, could destroy them altogether, that entire strange experiment that they've created in Afghanistan. Therefore they're nervous, therefore they're looking for ways out, if they can find one.
Well, one possible way, John, may be that they said earlier today that they would hand him over, in effect, if there were evidence, firm evidence, that he was responsible. Is that sign of a move on their part or not?
Well, it's difficult to say. They have said this before, you see. In the past, when the Americans have accused Osama bin Laden of carrying out, for instance, the bombings of the two embassies 3 years ago in Kenya and in Tanzania, they said then, yes, if you give us the clear evidence that he's responsible, you can have him. But what constitutes clear evidence for them is something altogether different for the Americans. So I frankly don't think that that's much more than trying to just kind of position themselves a little bit better and hope that the worst won't happen.
John, in Islamabad, thanks very much for joining us. Now, among the voices calling for calm today was that of the Prince of Wales. He's been visiting the West Country, and as he responded to events in America, he recalled the terrorist murder of his uncle, Lord Mountbatten, and that was over 20 years ago.
So many others. I feel deeply for what has happened in this, I think, simply horrendous tragedy that is hard to comprehend. And again, I can only say that all those who have lost their lives, and indeed those who are related and have loved ones who've lost their lives, are very much in my thoughts and prayers.
How much do you think there is a need now, sir, for cool heads?
I think, like all these things, there's a great need for cool heads. I mean, I remember so well when Lord Mountbatten was blown up in a boat that, like all these things, one always wants to rush around doing all sorts of things, but you have to, I think, sometimes think carefully. But I have nothing but the deepest sympathy, and we're all with the American people in this terrible tragedy.
Prince of Wales speaking a little earlier this afternoon now.